In the middle of the 14th century, the world was more connected than ever before. Thanks to the Silk Road and the remnants of the Mongol Empire, merchants crossed continents, exchanging goods, ideas, and technologies from across the world. But those same routes that brought prosperity will soon bring devastation, a global event that would reshape Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Modern genetic researches traces the origin of the 14th century pandemic to Central Asia, possibly near Lake Issyk-Kul in today's Kyrgyzstan. Local encryptions from around 1338 show an unusual spike in death, likely an early cluster of plague victims. From this point, Yersinia pestis spread along the Silk Road, carried by caravans, traders, and the communication networks of the remnants of the Mongol Empire. The same routes that once united Europe and Asia under the Pax Mongolica now carried a deadly traveler. Around 1346, the plague reached the Golden Horde, and particularly its army besieging the city of Kaffa in Crimea. At that time, this port was controlled by the Genoese, and they offered a fierce resistance to the Khan's troops. The latter, seeing his own troops decimated by an unknown disease, decided, according to some chroniclers, to throw infected corpses over the wall. The disease spread rapidly in the city, compelling its defender to surrender, and to embark on boats to go back to Europe, carrying the disease with them. In October 1347, Genoese ships reached Messina. Within months, the plague spread across Italy, southern France, Spain, and the Mediterranean islands. By 1348, it had crossed the Alps and the Pyrenees. By 1349, it reached England, Ireland, and Scandinavia. The symptoms were terrifying. Fever, vomiting, and the swollen lymph nodes, the buboes that gave the disease its name. Between 40 and 60% of Europe's population may have died. Some regions collapsed entirely, where others were simply abandoned. The psychological shock was immense. Entire generations grew up in the shadow of mass death. To give you some example of the magnitude of the devastation, Florence had over 120,000 inhabitants at the beginning of the 14th century, and after the Black Death, you would have to wait for the middle of the 19th century to get back to this number. European responses to the disease were shaped by fear and confusion. Medicine, deeply influenced by humoral theory, had no solution to offer. Many in that time believed the air was poisoned, while others feared divine punishment. And some communities violently persecuted minorities, especially Jews, in search of scapegoats. Yet, this was also the moment when early public health measures appeared. The Italian city-states, for example, experimented with isolation, surveillance on travelers, and the first quarantine, coming from 40 giorni, 40 days. Venice, for example, institutionalized these practices and built the world's first lazarettos, creating a model used for centuries that you can also build in EU5. But the plague, often studied via the European point of view, is not limited to this continent. The disease brought death and devastation across the old world in its entirety. The plague struck the Middle East with equal and sometimes greater severity than Europe. Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and Baghdad, among the largest cities of the world, lost enormous portions of their population. The historian El-Makrizi described cemeteries overflowing and markets collapsing. The Islamic world possessed quite sophisticated medical tradition, yet even scholars influenced by the text of Ibn Sina struggled to interpret the crisis. Multiple debates emerge around contagion, environment, and divine will. To add to the chaos, the pilgrimage routes, especially to Mecca, became unintended vectors for the transmission of the disease. China, on the other side of the world, had already been struck a little bit before Europe. During the last decade of the Yuan dynasty, plague outbreaks, famine, and political unrest overlapped. The tax register for this time showed dramatic population losses. though records are incomplete due to the wars that followed. The disease may have accelerated the fall of the Yuan dynasty and contributed strongly to the rise of the Ming dynasty in 1368. In the middle of all of this, the steppes acted both as reservoir and highway for the plague. The Mongol Empire's efficient relay station moved people, information, and also, sadly, infected rodents. This interconnected system explains why the Black Death spread so quickly and so far, affecting so easily the known world. In Persia, the Ilkhanate was already fragmenting when the plague arrived, and cities like Tabriz and Shiraz suffered heavy mortality. Agricultural decline, political instability, and the plague all combined to destabilize the region. The demographic shock contributed to the vacuum, later exploited by Timur in the late 14th century. The Indian subcontinent didn't experience the plague evenly. It is supposed that the plague reached northern India around 1350, and port cities linked to Red Sea and Persian Gulf saw the most severe outbreaks, while more inland areas were less affected. It is supposed that population density and settlement patterns may have slowed transmission inland. Nevertheless, India was not spared by the disease. Finally, North Africa, connected to Europe through intense Mediterranean trade, suffered widely. Egypt recorded repeated waves throughout the century. Further west, in the Maghreb, mortality varied between cities and nomadic zones. But the impact of the plague on Africa is still debated. While the latest researches show that Ethiopia was impacted by the plague almost as hard as Egypt, we can only assume this was the same case for sub-Saharan Africa. Well connected to the rest of the world at the time, one can only assume that the plague reached those lands. The Black Death is very important regarding the history of the peasant condition. Across Europe, Asia and North Africa, the population collapsed reshaped labor system. In Western Europe, workers gained bargaining power as labor grew scarce. And now, nobles had to bargain with laborers to keep them on their lands, triggering the progressive end of serfdom. But in Eastern Europe, however, landowners tightened this control, leading to the second serfdom. The division thus created in those different societies would persist for centuries. Contrary to most events in history, here it's more the absence of records that show that something happened. In Europe, for example, many notary offices stopped issuing deeds for a few years before a new notary took over the task. And for the writings covering the event, one would expect some tragic writings about death coming and people meeting their fate. But most of the time, there is a certain modesty and astonishment about all of these events. The trauma was so strong that societies took some time to adapt to it. And while no one was really telling anything in the texts, you can also see from the evolution of art, especially painting, the imprint that this pandemic had on the European psyche. The best example of this are the Danse Macabre, that existed before the Black Death but gained in popularity way after the event, throughout the 15th century, while it became a common memory in the European societies. Historians, like Patrick Boucheron, emphasize that the Black Death, apart from some modifications that we talked about earlier, did not fundamentally change societies. Apathy, acceptation, and adaptation to a new way of life among the survivors were the key words for the population after the disaster. And now, you can experience the Black Death and its ramifications yourself in Europa Universalis 5. Most of you that already played the game have experienced the sheer devastation that this situation brings. You've all learned by now not to get attached to your population at the start of the game. The situation starts, by default, dynamically, but you can set up different ways for it to appear in the menu. Default setting will cause the plague to appear around the steppe region, and it will spread rapidly from there. You have some decisions to help reduce the impact of the plague on your population. And while some are available right at the start of the situation, some others only unlock when the infected are in your country. Most of those decisions cost stability, making it a very useful resource at the beginning of the game. But you have to know, those decisions are not going to save your pops. The situation will end when there are no more provinces on the map that are affected by the plague. It could take 10 years or more. But this means that for a while, your entire population will be protected from the plagues. But this does not mean that the plague will disappear entirely for the game. As in reality, the Black Plague came back again and again, on specific locations until the 18th century. We hope that you enjoyed this video. If you need more information about the plague, there will be some source in the description of the video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, as the community team will happily provide you with many more videos about Europa Universalis 5.